The rusted chains groaned against the December wind as Maria Santos stood knee-deep in twisted metal and broken dreams. Her calloused hands gripped the yellowed envelope that had changed everything. The deed to Hartwell Construction's abandoned crane yard, a graveyard of industrial giants that stretched across 43 acres of what the town council called an eyesore, and what her late husband Tommy had called potential. The laughter still echoed in her ears from this morning's town meeting. Mayor Richardson's smirk had been particularly cutting when he'd announced her inheritance to the room full of contractors, city planners, and business owners. "Ladies and gentlemen," he'd said, his voice dripping with manufactured sympathy, "it seems our local mechanic, Maria Santos, has inherited Harold Hartwell's little situation." The word situation had hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Behind her, the sound of tires crunching on gravel announced the arrival of her best friend, Carmen Rodriguez, whose beat-up Honda Civic looked almost pristine compared to the skeletal remains of construction equipment that surrounded them. Carmen stepped out, her nurse scrubs still bearing traces of her 12-hour shift at County General, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that had seen better days. "Dios mío, Maria," Carmen breathed, surveying the devastation. "When you said it was bad, I thought you meant, I don't know, maybe some broken windows and rust." Maria kicked at a piece of corrugated metal, sending it clanging against what had once been the cabin of a tower crane. Harold Hartwell was Tommy's mentor back in the day. Taught him everything about heavy machinery. Tommy always said Harold was like a father to him after his own dad died. The crane yard stretched before them like a metallic desert. Dozens of cranes in various states of decay dotted the landscape, some missing their jibs, others with their towers collapsed like the spines of prehistoric beasts. Weeds grew through broken concrete, and puddles of rainwater reflected the gray December sky from oil-stained depressions in the earth. Carmen pulled her jacket tighter. "So, why did he leave this to you instead of his family?" "That's what everyone's wondering." Maria walked toward the largest structure, a massive mobile crane whose yellow paint had faded to the color of old mustard. His nephew Frank was furious at the reading. "Keeps saying I must have manipulated the old man somehow." The lawyer said Harold was very specific. "The entire yard goes to Maria Santos, the only person who understood what Tommy saw in broken things." A memory flickered through Maria's mind like sunlight through storm clouds. 3 years ago, just months before Tommy's accident, they'd driven past this very yard on their way to the hardware store. The place had been operational then, Harold Hartwell's construction company still limping along despite the economic downturn. Tommy had pointed to a crane operator working the big leaper near the front gate. "That's Harold," Tommy had said with genuine affection. "Man's been working cranes for 50 years, started when they were all cable-operated death traps. Now look at him, 78 years old and still running jobs that would scare men half his age."
But that was before Harold's company went under, before the bank foreclosure, before the equipment repossession that turned productive machinery into abandoned monuments to failed dreams. Harold had fought tooth and nail to keep his business alive, taking out loan after loan, selling everything he owned except this yard, and the cranes too damaged or outdated to be worth the repo men's time. Now, as Maria climbed up into the cab of the faded yellow crane, she found Harold's final message to her, a handwritten note tucked under the sun visor, written in the shaky cursive of arthritic hands. "Maria, Tommy always said you saw things others missed. The bank took my company, but they couldn't take what really mattered. Look beyond the rust. Look beyond what everyone else sees. The answer is in the foundation. H. Hartwell." Carmen read over her shoulder. "What do you think he means?" Before Maria could answer, another vehicle pulled into the yard, a pristine black SUV that belonged to Frank Hartwell, Harold's nephew, and the man who'd expected to inherit everything. Frank stepped out wearing a tailored coat that probably cost more than Maria made in 2 months at Rodriguez Auto Repair, where she'd worked as head mechanic since Tommy's death on that rain-slicked highway 18 months ago. Frank approached with the measured stride of a man accustomed to getting his way. At 45, he ran the most successful real estate development company in 3 counties, specializing in turning distressed properties into strip malls and luxury apartments. His perfectly styled hair and manicured hands had never known the honest weight of a wrench or the satisfaction of coaxing life back into broken machinery. "Maria," he called out, his voice carrying the false warmth of a politician, "I wanted to speak with you about this misunderstanding." Maria climbed down from the crane, Harold's note folded safely in her pocket. "No misunderstanding, Frank. Your uncle was very clear." "Look around you," Frank gestured broadly, "at the devastation. This isn't an inheritance, it's a burden. The city's been trying to force Harold to clean this up for 2 years. The environmental impact alone, there's probably contaminated soil, groundwater issues. You're looking at hundreds of thousands in cleanup costs before you can even think about selling the land." Carmen moved closer to Maria, a gesture of solidarity that didn't go unnoticed. Frank's eyes flicked between them with the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up potential obstacles. "I'm prepared to make you an offer. $50,000 cash, and I'll handle all the cleanup and legal issues. You walk away clean, and I deal with Uncle Harold's mess." The offer hung in the air, like the scent of rain before a storm. $50,000 was more money than Maria had ever seen at one time. It would pay off the mortgage on the small house she and Tommy had shared. It would give her a cushion while she figured out what came next in a life that felt like it had ended, along with Tommy's on that rain-slicked highway 18 months ago. But something in Frank's eyes, something too eager, too desperate, made her hesitate. "Why are you so interested in cleaning up your uncle's mess?" she asked. Frank's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Family responsibility. Harold may have made some questionable decisions in his final years, but I won't let his legacy become a laughingstock." As if summoned by the word laughingstock, another car pulled into the yard. This one a rusted pickup truck that belonged to Joey Martinez, one of the crane operators who'd worked for Harold until the bitter end. Joey approached the group with mud on his boots and genuine concern in his dark eyes. "Maria, I heard about the meeting this morning. People are saying some pretty cruel things." "Let 'em talk," Maria replied, though the words stung more than she cared to admit. "Harold was a good man," Joey said, his voice carrying the weight of conviction. "Whatever he saw in this place, whatever reason he had for leaving it to you, it wasn't charity. Harold didn't do charity. Everything he did had a purpose."
Frank's expression darkened. "With respect, Joey, you're hardly qualified to understand the complexities of property management and urban development. And you never understood the complexities of honest work," Joey shot back. The tension between the two men crackled like electricity before a lightning strike. Frank represented everything that had squeezed Harold's company to death. The slick developers who underbid local contractors, the corporate entities that treated construction workers like disposable parts. Joey represented the old guard, the craftsmen who took pride in their work and loyalty to their employers. As the three of them stood in the growing dusk, surrounded by the shadows of fallen giants, Maria felt the weight of decision pressing down on her like the gray December sky. In her pocket, Harold's note seemed to pulse with hidden meaning. The foundation, what did he meant? The sound of another approaching vehicle broke the standoff. This time it was a white van with Channel 7 News emblazoned on the side. Maria's heart sank as she recognized Rebecca Walsh, the ambitious young reporter who'd been covering the town's urban blight issues for the past 6 months. Rebecca emerged from the van followed by her cameraman,
her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the wind, her smile bright as Klieg lights. Maria Santos, Rebecca Walsh, Channel 7 News. I understand you've inherited quite a unique property? Would you be willing to share your thoughts on the community's reaction to your inheritance? The question was a loaded gun disguised as curiosity. Maria could see Frank stepping back, positioning himself outside the camera's range, a strategic retreat that spoke of media experience and calculated image management. I don't think, Maria began. The community is understandably concerned, Rebecca continued, her tone suggesting she was doing Maria a favor by allowing her to respond. This property has been an eyesore for 2 years. Many residents feel that inheriting such a liability shows poor judgment on Harold Hartwell's part. Do you have any plans for remediation? The word liability hit Maria like a physical blow. She thought of the laughter at the town meeting, the way Mayor Richardson had made her inheritance sound like a practical joke played by a senile old man. She thought of Tommy's faith in broken things, his belief that everything could be fixed with enough patience and understanding. Harold Hartwell built half the buildings in this county. His cranes helped construct the hospital where my friend Carmen saves lives, the school where our children learn, the bridges that connect our communities. If his final gift looks like a liability to some people, maybe they're not looking hard enough. Rebecca's eyebrows rose slightly. This wasn't the defensive, apologetic response she'd expected. But surely you understand the environmental concerns, the impact on property values, the safety hazards. Before Maria could respond, Joey stepped forward, his bulky frame partially blocking the camera. You want to talk about safety hazards? Talk about the strip mall Frank Hartwell built on the old Miller farm, the one with the foundation problems that everyone knows about, but nobody wants to address because Frank pays too much in property taxes. Frank's sharp intake of breath was audible. Rebecca's eyes lit up with the scent of a bigger story, but before she could pursue it, Maria moved to Maria's other side. This interview is over, Carmen announced, with the authoritative voice she used to clear emergency rooms during Friday night chaos. Maria has nothing more to say right now. As Rebecca and her cameraman reluctantly packed up their equipment, Frank made one last attempt. Maria, please think about my offer. Don't let pride cloud your judgment. This place is going to destroy you financially if you're not careful. After everyone had left, Maria and Carmen sat in Carmen's car as darkness settled over the crane yard like a heavy blanket. The skeletal silhouettes of the abandoned cranes looked like monuments in an ancient cemetery, each one marking the death of someone's dreams.
"What are you thinking?" Carmen asked softly. Maria pulled Harold's note from her pocket and read it again by the light of her phone. "Look beyond the rust. Look beyond what everyone else sees. The answer is in the foundation." "Maybe he hid something," Carmen suggested, "like money or documents that could help you sell the place for more than Frank's offering." "Maybe." But even as she said it, Maria felt that wasn't the whole truth. Harold's message felt deeper, more complex than a simple treasure hunt. Tommy had taught her to listen to machinery, to hear the stories that metal and oil and wear patterns told. Maybe Harold was asking her to listen to this place in the same way. As they drove away from the crane yard, Maria caught a glimpse of movement in her rearview mirror. Someone walking among the cranes with a flashlight. For a moment, she considered turning around, but exhaustion weighed heavier than curiosity. Tomorrow, she decided, she would come back alone. Tomorrow, she would start listening to what this graveyard of dreams was trying to tell her. If you're enjoying Maria's incredible journey, please hit that like button and subscribe for more amazing stories that will blow your mind. Maria's alarm clock screamed at 5:30 a.m., just as it had every morning for the past 18 months. The sound used to wake both of them, him groaning theatrically while she laughed and pushed him toward the shower. Now, the sound echoed through the empty bedroom like an accusation, reminding her that she faced another day of pretending to be whole when half of herself had died on Highway 92. She stumbled to the kitchen, muscle memory guiding her through the ritual of coffee preparation. 2 scoops in the filter, water to the 4-cup line, switch on. Only after the machine began its familiar gurgling did she remember, again, that she was making coffee for one. The kitchen table bore the evidence of last night's research session, printouts of property records, environmental impact studies, and photographs of Harold Hartwell's construction company in its heyday. She'd stayed up until nearly 2 a.m. trying to understand what she'd inherited. But the more she learned, the more overwhelming it became. The Hartwell Construction Company had been a cornerstone of the local economy for 37 years. Harold had started with a single crane and a dream, building his reputation one job at a time until he employed 43 people and operated the largest fleet of heavy machinery in the county. His company had built the water treatment plant, the new wing of County General Hospital, and the overpass that connected the east and west sides of town. But the 2008 recession had hit construction companies hard, and Harold's traditional, relationship-based business model couldn't compete with larger corporations that underbid contracts and cut corners on safety and quality. The slide had been gradual at first, losing a bid here, laying off workers there, but by 2018, it had become an avalanche of debt and desperation. Maria sipped her coffee and studied a photograph from the local newspaper's archives, dated just 5 years ago. Harold stood in front of his crane yard when it had been a bustling hub of activity. Workers in hard caps moved with purpose between the machines, and the cranes themselves gleamed with fresh paint and proper maintenance. Harold's smile in the photo was genuine, proud, the expression of a man who'd built something meaningful. Her phone buzzed with a text from Carmen. "How are you holding up me, huh? Call if you need anything." Before she could respond, another text arrived, this one from an unknown number. "Saw you on the news last night. You looked good standing up to that reporter. Don't let the bastards wear you down. J." Joey Martinez, she realized, the crane operator who defended her yesterday. His loyalty to Harold seemed to extend to her now too, though she wondered if she had earned it or simply inherited it along with everything else. At 6:15, Maria locked her house and made the familiar drive to Rodriguez Auto Repair, where she'd worked for the past 7 years. The garage sat on the corner of Main and Oak, a modest building that her boss Miguel Rodriguez had inherited from his father 23 years ago.
Miguel had hired Maria initially as a favor to Tommy, but she'd quickly proven herself capable of diagnostic work that most mechanics couldn't handle. Miguel was already at the garage when she arrived, his stocky frame hunched over the engine of Mrs. Patterson's Buick. At 55, Miguel had the permanent oil stains under his fingernails that marked a man who'd spent his life elbow-deep in automotive problems. But his eyes still lit up with genuine pleasure when a particularly challenging repair crossed his bay. "Morning, Maria," he called without looking up from the engine. "How are you holding up after yesterday's circus?" "You heard about it?" Miguel straightened, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better decades. "Rebecca Walsh called here this morning, asking questions about you. Wanted to know if you were financially stable enough to handle such a significant environmental responsibility. I told her to call back when she learned some manners." The loyalty in his voice made Maria's throat tighten. Since Tommy's death, Miguel had become more than just her boss. He was the closest thing to a father figure she had left. He'd held her job open during the 3 weeks she'd been too devastated to get out of bed. He'd covered for her when grief made her hands shake too badly to hold tools. He'd never once made her feel like charity. "People are talking," she said quietly. "People always talk, usually about things they don't understand." Miguel picked up a wrench and tossed it to her with practiced ease. "Mrs. Patterson's Buick is making that sound again, the one that's not quite a knock but isn't exactly normal either. Thought you might want to take a listen." Work had become Maria's salvation in the months after Tommy's death. The honesty of mechanical problems, the clear relationship between cause and effect, the satisfaction of restoration, these things provided structure when the rest of her life felt like it was built on quicksand. She popped the hood of the Buick and listened to the engine idle, her trained ear picking up the subtle irregularity that had Mrs. Patterson worried. It wasn't a knock. The sound was higher-pitched, more intermittent. She moved around the engine bay, using a mechanic's stethoscope to isolate the source of the noise. Timing chain tensioner, she diagnosed after 5 minutes of careful listening. It's not critical yet, but it will be soon. Miguel nodded approvingly. That's what I figured, but I wanted your confirmation before I quoted Mrs. Patterson the repair cost. As Maria began the process of removing the engine cover to access the timing chain, her mind drifted to Harold's cranes. Were they really beyond salvation, as everyone seemed to believe, or were they just complicated problems that required patient diagnosis and the right approach? The morning passed in the comfortable rhythm of repair work. Maria replaced Mrs. Patterson's timing chain tensioner, diagnosed a mysterious electrical drain in a Honda Civic, and helped Miguel install new brake pads on a contractor's pickup truck. Each repair followed the same basic pattern: identify the problem, understand its cause, implement the solution, test the results. At lunch, she sat in the garage's small office, eating a sandwich she'd packed at home while reading more about Harold's company. According to the financial documents she'd found online, Hartwell Construction had assets worth nearly $2 million at its peak. Even accounting for depreciation and debt, the crane yard should have been worth something significant. So why was Frank so eager to buy it for $50,000? Her phone rang, interrupting her research. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, the voice was familiar. Miss Santos, this is attorney Jonathan Fitzgerald. I handled Mr. Hartwell's estate. I was wondering if you might have time to meet this afternoon. There are some additional documents Mr. Hartwell asked me to give you after you'd had a chance to visit the property.
More documents. More mysteries. Maria agreed to meet at Fitzgerald's office at 4 o'clock, then spent the rest of her lunch break staring at photographs of Harold's cranes, trying to see beyond the rust and abandonment to whatever truth Harold had wanted her to find. The afternoon brought a steady stream of routine repairs, but Maria's concentration kept drifting to the crane yard. She found herself remembering conversations with Tommy about Harold, fragments of stories about the old man's legendary attention to detail and his reputation for engineering solutions that other contractors couldn't imagine. Harold never met a job he couldn't figure out, Tommy had told her once. Other guys would look at a project and say it was impossible. Harold would look at the same project and start sketching out crane configurations and load calculations. He saw possibilities where everyone else saw problems. At 3:45, Maria washed the grease from her hands and drove across town to Attorney Fitzgerald's office. The law firm of Fitzgerald, Webb & Associates occupied a converted Victorian house on Elm Street, the kind of dignified, understated building that suggested competence without ostentation. Jonathan Fitzgerald was a thin man in his early 60s with silver hair and the careful demeanor of someone who'd spent his career helping people navigate life's complications. His office was lined with law books and family photographs, creating an atmosphere of both professionalism and warmth. Mr. Hartwell was very specific about the timing of this meeting, Fitzgerald began, settling behind his mahogany desk. He wanted you to see the property first, to form your own impressions before I gave you this. He handed her a thick manila envelope sealed with red wax, old-fashioned and formal, like something from an earlier century. Maria's name was written across the front in Harold's shaky handwriting. He also wanted me to tell you that he watched you work on your husband's truck several times. He was impressed by your patience and your willingness to keep trying different approaches until you found the solution. Maria's hands trembled slightly as she broke the wax seal. Inside the envelope were 3 items: a folded letter, a small brass key, and a hand-drawn map of the crane yard with certain areas marked in red ink. The letter was written in the same careful cursive as the note she'd found in the crane cab. Dear Maria, by now you've seen what everyone else sees, a yard full of broken dreams and failed machinery. The town council calls it an eyesore. Frank calls it a liability. The news reporter probably called it worse. But Tommy saw potential in broken things, and he married a woman who shares that gift. I'm betting you see something else when you look in my cranes. The brass key opens a storage container buried beneath the main office foundation. You'll need Joey Martinez to help you with that. He knows about the container, and he has the equipment to move the concrete slab that covers it. What you'll find there will change how everyone sees this place. But more than that, it will change how everyone sees you. I spent 50 years building things that lasted. This is my final construction project, and you're the foreman I've chosen to see it through. Look for the truth in the foundation, Maria. It's been waiting for someone with the right eyes to find it. Respectfully yours, Harold Hartwell. P.S. Don't trust Frank. His interest in this property isn't what it seems.
Maria looked up to find Fitzgerald watching her with keen interest. Did you know what he was planning? Mr. Hartwell was a complicated man with a long memory, Fitzgerald replied carefully. He never forgot a favor, and he never forgot a slight. Your husband did him a significant kindness once. Fixed his personal truck on Christmas Eve when every other garage was closed, refused to take payment because it was Christmas. Harold never forgot gestures like that. But there has to be more to it than gratitude. Fitzgerald smiled. Mr. Hartwell believed that most people see only the surface of things. He thought you might be different. I guess we'll find out if he was right. As Maria drove home, Harold's letter and key burning like fire in her purse, she realized that her simple inheritance had become something far more complex. Harold hadn't just left her a crane yard, he'd left her a puzzle, a challenge, and possibly a trap. The red marks on his hand-drawn map indicated specific locations throughout the property: the main office building, several crane positions, and what appeared to be a spot near the back fence line. Each mark was accompanied by numbers that might have been measurements or coordinates. That evening, Maria sat at her kitchen table with Harold's map spread before her, trying to decipher his intentions. The marked locations seemed random at first glance, but as she studied the map more carefully, a pattern began to emerge. The marks weren't random. They followed the property's natural drainage patterns, indicating spots where water would naturally collect during heavy rains. Why would Harold care about drainage patterns? What was he trying to tell her? Her phone rang at 9 o'clock. Joey Martinez's voice was tight with urgency. Maria, you need to know Frank Hartwell was at the crane yard tonight with some guys I've never seen before. They had surveying equipment, and they were taking measurements of the entire property. Surveying equipment? Professional stuff, the kind developers use when they're planning major construction projects. They didn't see me. I was checking on some tools I left in the back section, but they were definitely up to something. After Joey hung up, Maria stared at Harold's map with new understanding. Frank's eagerness to buy the property, his knowledge of environmental issues, his quick offer of $50,000, it all suggested he knew something about the land that others didn't. But Harold's letter suggested he knew something too, something that Frank either didn't know or was desperately trying to keep secret. Maria made herself a cup of tea and settled back at the table with Harold's documents. Tomorrow, she would call Joey and arrange to open Harold's hidden storage container. Tomorrow, she would begin to understand what Harold Hartwell had really left her. Tonight, she would plan. This story gets even more unbelievable. If you don't want to miss what Maria discovers next, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't believe what happens next. The call came at 6:17 a.m., shattering Maria's restless sleep like glass against concrete. Joey's voice carried a tension that made her instantly alert despite her exhaustion. "Maria, you need to get down here now. Someone trashed the crane yard last night." By the time she arrived at the property, a small crowd had gathered near the entrance gate. Joey stood beside his pickup truck, his face grim as he surveyed the damage. Someone had used sledgehammers and crowbars to destroy what little remained intact in the yard. Windows that had survived years of abandonment were now shattered. Copper wiring had been stripped from several cranes, leaving jagged scars in the metal. Most disturbing of all, someone had used spray paint to deface Harold's cranes with crude messages: "Eyesore, demolish this dump, and Santos go home."
Carmen arrived 15 minutes after Maria, her nursing uniform suggesting she'd driven straight from her night shift at the hospital. She took one look at the destruction and pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the police." "Already did," Joey said. "They'll be here within the hour. But Maria, there's something else you need to see." He led her to the spot where Harold's map indicated the buried storage container should be located. The ground had been torn up, churned into muddy chaos by some kind of heavy machinery. Deep tire tracks suggested someone had brought in excavating equipment during the night. "They were looking for something specific," Joey observed, kneeling to examine the disturbed earth. "This isn't random vandalism. Someone knew exactly where to dig." Maria's blood ran cold as she realized the implications. Someone else had Harold's map, or someone else knew about the buried container. The systematic nature of the search suggested this wasn't opportunistic destruction, but calculated treasure hunting. Sheriff Deputy Angela Morrison arrived 45 minutes later, her patrol car crunching over broken glass as she entered the yard. At 32, Morrison had built a reputation as the county's most thorough investigator, combining street-smart instincts with academic training in forensic science. Her Latina heritage had given her insight into the community dynamics that often escaped her older male colleagues. "Miss Santos," Morrison said, stepping carefully around the scattered debris, "this is extensive damage. Any idea who might have done this?" Before Maria could answer, another vehicle entered the yard, Frank Hartwell's black SUV. Frank emerged wearing work clothes instead of his usual tailored attire, his expression carefully arranged into a mask of concerned sympathy. "Maria, I heard about the vandalism. This is exactly what I was worried about. Properties like this attract criminal activity." Deputy Morrison's eyes sharpened. "And you are?" "Frank Hartwell, Harold Hartwell's nephew. I've been trying to help Maria understand the challenges of owning this property." "Help how?" Morrison asked, her tone neutral but attentive. Frank's smile never wavered. "I've offered to purchase the property and handle all the cleanup responsibilities. Unfortunately, Miss Santos hasn't been receptive to reasonable solutions." The word reasonable carried the weight of condescension, the implication that Maria was being irrational or stubborn. Joey stepped forward, his bulk creating a physical barrier between Frank and Maria. "Funny how this vandalism happened right after you were here with surveying equipment," Joey said, his voice carrying the thread of barely controlled anger. Frank's composure cracked slightly. "I don't know what you're suggesting, but I'm not suggesting anything," Joey interrupted. "I'm stating facts. You were here last night with professional surveying equipment. Now the place has been systematically searched and destroyed. Seems like quite a coincidence." Deputy Morrison was taking notes now, her attention focused on the interaction between Frank and Joey. "Mr. Hartwell, can you account for your whereabouts between midnight and 6 a.m. this morning?" "Of course. I was at home with my wife. We hosted a dinner party for some business associates until around 11:30, then went to bed." Morrison wrote down the alibi information, then turned to Maria. "Miss Santos, I need to ask, is there anything of value on this property that someone might be looking for?" The question hung in the air like smoke for the gunshot. Maria felt Harold's brass key burning in her pocket, his letters' warnings echoing in her memory. She glanced at Joey, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "I think there might be," she said carefully.
Harold Hartwell left me some documents that suggest he hid something on the property for safekeeping. Frank's face went pale. What kind of documents? That's between me and Harold, Maria replied, watching Frank's reaction with growing suspicion. Over the next hour, Deputy Morrison documented the damage while Maria and Joey searched for Harold's hidden container. Using Joey's metal detector and the measurements from Harold's map, they located the buried storage unit beneath 3 feet of disturbed earth. The container itself was a military surplus ammunition box, waterproofed and sealed with heavy-duty locks. Harold's brass key opened it easily, revealing contents that made Maria's hands shake with excitement and terror. Inside were financial documents dating back 23 years, geological survey reports, environmental impact studies, and most shocking of all, a folder marked Confidential, containing correspondence between Harold Hartwell and a consortium of mining companies interested in the mineral rights to his property. The geological surveys revealed what Harold had discovered, but apparently never disclosed. His 43 acres sat atop one of the largest rare earth mineral deposits ever found in the continental United States. The land was worth $75 million, maybe more. Harold had discovered a conspiracy to steal it. The correspondence revealed a complex web of negotiations, bribes, and corporate espionage that stretched back over 2 decades. Several major mining companies had been quietly purchasing surrounding properties, apparently intending to assemble enough acreage for a major extraction operation. Harold's land was the key piece they needed to make the project viable. But Harold had refused to sell, despite increasingly aggressive offers and mounting financial pressure. The final letter in the file, dated just 6 months before his death, was from Meridian Mining Corporation, a subsidiary of a larger conglomerate that included real estate development companies, including Hartwell Development, Frank's company. Maria read the letter aloud to Joey and Deputy Morrison, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. Mr. Hartwell, our final offer of $15 million represents more than generous compensation for your property. Continued resistance to this transaction will result in escalated pressure through regulatory and financial channels. We suggest you reconsider your position before circumstances become more difficult. The letter was signed by Richard Blackwood, CEO of Meridian Mining, but it included a carbon copy notation indicating Frank Hartwell had received a copy of all correspondence. Deputy Morrison was photographing every document with her phone, building a case file that was growing more complex by the minute. Miss Santos, this suggests your property is worth significantly more than $50,000. It suggests my nephew knew exactly what he was trying to steal, Maria said, looking directly at Frank. Frank's carefully maintained composure finally shattered. You have no idea what you're dealing with, he snapped. This isn't some feel-good story about the little guy winning against big business. There are forces at work here that will crush you if you get in their way. Is that a threat? Maria asked, her hand moving instinctively toward her service weapon. It's reality, Frank replied, but he was already backing toward his SUV. Maria, you have 48 hours to reconsider my offer. After that, things get complicated.
As Frank drove away, Morrison turned to Maria with an expression of grim determination. Miss Santos, I think you're going to need protection and legal representation. What you found here could trigger a federal investigation into corporate fraud and mineral rights manipulation. The magnitude of the situation began to settle over Maria like a heavy blanket. She owned land worth potentially hundreds of millions of dollars, but she also owned a target painted on her back by people with the resources and ruthlessness to destroy her life. That afternoon, 3 more incidents occurred in rapid succession, each one designed to increase pressure on Maria to sell the property quickly and quietly. First,
The city's building inspector arrived with a clipboard full of violations and a notice requiring immediate cleanup of the crane yard or facing daily fines of $5,000. The inspector, a nervous man named Peterson who clearly wanted to be anywhere else, explained apologetically that he'd received orders from Mayor Richardson to enforce all applicable codes immediately. "I'm sorry, Miss Santos, but I have to follow protocol. The property needs to be brought into compliance within 30 days, or the city will begin condemnation proceedings." Second, Maria's insurance company called to inform her that her coverage had been canceled effective immediately due to increased risk factors associated with industrial property ownership. The representative, reading from what was obviously a prepared script, explained that the company could no longer provide coverage for properties with significant environmental and liability concerns. Third, and most troubling, Miguel called from the garage to tell her that two men in expensive suits had visited Rodriguez Auto Repair, asking detailed questions about Maria's financial situation, work history, and personal relationships. "They claimed to be from some kind of investment company," Miguel said, his voice tight with worry. "But they didn't feel right, Maria. They asked too many personal questions, and they seemed to know things about you that legitimate businessmen shouldn't know." By evening, Maria felt like she was under siege from forces she couldn't fully identify or understand. The discovery of Harold's documents transformed her inheritance from a burden into a battleground, with stakes she was only beginning to comprehend. Carmen arrived at Maria's house at 7 o'clock, carrying takeout Chinese food and a bottle of wine. "You look like you haven't eaten all day," she said, bustling into the kitchen with the determined efficiency that made her such an effective nurse. As they ate lo mein and sweet and sour chicken, Maria spread Harold's documents across the dining room table, creating a timeline of the conspiracy that had been unfolding around Harold's property for over 2 decades. The pattern that emerged was both sophisticated and ruthless. "Look at this," Maria said, pointing to a series of property transactions from 2019. Meridian Mining's parent company bought 7 different properties surrounding Harold's land, all through shell companies with different names. The sellers probably never knew they were all selling to the same entity. Carmen studied the documents with the analytical mind that made her excel at emergency medicine. And Frank's company handled 3 of these transactions as the listing agent. He was working both sides, helping the mining company acquire land while pressuring Harold to sell. The doorbell rang at 8:30, interrupting their investigation. Through the peephole, Maria saw Joey Martinez standing on her front porch, but he wasn't alone. Behind him stood an elderly black woman with silver hair and the upright posture of someone accustomed to command. "Maria," Joey said when she opened the door, "I'd like you to meet Dolores Washington. She worked as Harold's bookkeeper for 37 years, and she has some things you need to know." Dolores Washington was 74 years old, with keen eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and hands that bore the calluses of a lifetime spent managing both books and people. She carried herself with the dignity of someone who had weathered decades of discrimination and emerged stronger for the experience. "Harold Hartwell was the finest man I ever worked for," Dolores said, settling into Maria's living room with the careful movements of arthritic joints. "He paid fair wages when other contractors cut corners on labor costs. He promoted based on ability, not connections. And when the pressure started mounting to sell his land, he asked me to help him document everything." She opened a worn leather briefcase and removed another set of documents, financial records, correspondence, and photographs that filled in the gaps in Harold's hidden archive. "The harassment started in 2018, Dolores explained. First, it was just aggressive sales calls and unsolicited offers. Then the bank started calling in loans that had never been problems before. Suppliers who'd given Harold credit for 20 years suddenly demanded cash on delivery. Inspection teams showed up at job sites looking for violations they'd never cared about previously." Carmen leaned forward. "They were trying to force him out of business." "More than that," Dolores replied.
They were trying to destroy his reputation so that when he finally had to sell, no one would question why such a successful businessman was liquidating everything. She handed Maria a photograph that made her blood run cold. It showed Frank Hartwell shaking hands with Richard Blackwood of Meridian Mining at what appeared to be a formal dinner. The photo was dated 3 years ago, long before Frank's public concern about his uncle's declining judgment. Harold hired a private investigator in 2019, Dolores continued. He suspected Frank was working against him, but he needed proof. What he found was worse than family betrayal. It was a coordinated campaign to acquire his land through financial manipulation and corporate pressure. Joey pulled out his phone and showed Maria a video he had recorded earlier that day. "After you left the crane yard this afternoon, I stuck around to see if anyone else would show up. Look what I captured." The video showed 2 unmarked white vans entering the crane yard after dark. Men in coveralls emerged and began setting up sophisticated equipment around the property. Not just metal detectors, but ground-penetrating radar and geological sensing devices. "They're not looking for hidden documents," Joey said grimly. "They're confirming the mineral surveys. Someone wants to verify the deposit exists before they make their next move." Dolores nodded knowingly. Harold saw this coming. That's why he started hiding documents, why he moved his most valuable equipment to secure storage, and why he chose you as his heir. "But why me?" Maria asked. "I barely knew him."
Harold believed that institutional power would always try to crush individual resistance, Dolores explained. He needed someone outside the system, someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated by the usual pressure tactics, someone with nothing to lose and everything to gain from fighting back. Carmen stood up and moved to the window, peering through the curtains at the street outside. "There's a dark sedan parked across the street that wasn't there an hour ago. 2 men inside, and they're watching this house." The reality of their situation crashed over Maria like a wave. She wasn't just dealing with a property dispute. She was caught in the middle of a multi-million-dollar corporate conspiracy with people who had already demonstrated their willingness to use intimidation and possibly violence to achieve their goals. "What do I do?" she asked, feeling overwhelmed by forces far beyond her experience as a small-town mechanic. Dolores smiled, and for the first time that evening, her expression carried hope instead of worry. "Harold left you more than just land and documents, dear. He left you allies." She pulled out her phone and began making calls. The first was to attorney Jonathan Fitzgerald, who, despite the late hour, answered immediately. The second was to someone she called Judge, speaking in the respectful but familiar tone of long association. The third call was to the Environmental Protection Agency, where Dolores apparently had contacts from Harold's battles with regulatory pressure. Harold spent 3 years building a network of people who were watching this situation. Journalists, investigators, federal agents, and legal advocates who were waiting for the right moment to expose what Meridian Mining and their local accomplices had been doing. Within an hour, Maria's quiet house had become a command center for what Dolores called Harold's final construction project, the demolition of the conspiracy that had destroyed his business and threatened his community. The first ally to arrive was Margaret Chen, an investigative journalist from the state capitol who specialized in exposing corporate fraud and environmental crimes. Margaret was 41 years old, with the intense focus of someone who'd built her career on uncovering truths that powerful people wanted to keep hidden. "Margaret contacted me 18 months ago," she explained, setting up a laptop on Maria's dining room table. He'd been documenting Meridian Mining's activities for years, but he needed someone with the resources to investigate their corporate structure and political connections. She opened a series of files that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. The mining company had bought off half the town, the mayor, city council, even the district attorney. "The rare earth mineral deposit under Maria's property is just the beginning," Margaret said, pointing to geological maps that showed the potential extent of the mineral formation. We're talking about materials essential for electronics, renewable energy systems, and defense applications. The second ally was Dr. James Reeves, the retired EPA scientist who'd been tracking Meridian mining. Meridian has a pattern, Dr. Reeves explained, spreading out case files from similar operations in Colorado, Montana, and Wyoming. They identify mineral deposits on privately owned land, then use local corporate networks to pressure property owners into selling. If that doesn't work, they escalate to regulatory harassment and financial manipulation. He showed Maria photographs from Meridian's operation in Montana, where they'd successfully acquired a 12,000-acre rare earth mining site. The environmental damage was catastrophic: groundwater contamination, soil poisoning, and air quality issues that affected 3 counties. The company paid minimal fines and moved on to their next target. Carmen had been quietly listening to the revelations, but now she spoke up with the practical urgency of someone accustomed to crisis management. "This is all very informative, but Maria is in immediate danger. We need to focus on protecting her before we worry about exposing anyone else."
As if summoned by her words, Joey's phone buzzed with a text message that made his face go pale. He showed the screen to the group. "Tell your friend to accept Frank's offer. Some accidents can't be prevented. You have 24 hours. The message had come from a blocked number, but the implication was clear. The pressure campaign was escalating to direct threats of violence. Attorney Fitzgerald arrived at Maria's house at 11:47 p.m., carrying a briefcase full of legal documents and the grim expression of someone who'd spent his career fighting against institutional corruption. At 63, Fitzgerald had built his practice defending individuals against corporate overreach, and Harold's case represented everything he dedicated his professional life to opposing. "I've been expecting this call for 2 years," he said, settling into Maria's living room with the familiarity of a man prepared for battle. "Harold retained me specifically to handle the legal aspects of exposing Meridian Mining's activities. We've been building a federal case that includes violations of environmental law, securities fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit extortion." He opened his briefcase and removed a thick document bound with legal ribbons. "This is a federal lawsuit against Meridian Mining, BlackRock Resources, and 14 local accomplices, including Frank Hartwell and Mayor Richardson. Harold spent 3 years documenting their activities, and we've been waiting for the right moment to file." Margaret Chen looked up from her laptop. "How strong is the case?" "With the evidence Harold collected and the documents Maria found today, it's airtight," Fitzgerald replied. "We have financial records, recorded phone conversations, documented threats, and a paper trail that shows systematic harassment and fraud. But filing the lawsuit will make Maria an even bigger target." "I'm already a target," Maria said quietly. "The question is whether I fight back or spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder." Dr. Reeves spread out environmental impact studies across the coffee table. "There's another consideration. If Meridian Mining succeeds in acquiring this land, the environmental damage will affect everyone in a 50-mile radius. We're talking about mining operations that use toxic chemicals to separate rare earth elements from rock. The process contaminates groundwater, destroys topsoil, and releases harmful particulates into the air." He showed Maria photographs from similar mining operations, landscapes that looked like alien worlds, with poisoned earth and dead trees stretching to the horizon. "This is what your community will look like if Meridian gets their way." The weight of responsibility settled over Maria like a lead blanket. She owned land worth potentially hundreds of millions of dollars, but she also owned the power to prevent environmental catastrophe that would affect thousands of innocent people. Carmen moved to the window again and reported that the surveillance car was still there, now joined by a second vehicle. "We need to get Maria somewhere safe before we make any decisions about lawsuits or environmental protection." Joey stood up, his bulky frame radiating protective determination. "I know a place.
My uncle owns a cabin about 40 miles north of here, completely off the grid. We can take her there while the legal and media people do their work." But even as they planned Maria's temporary escape, the sound of breaking glass from the kitchen shattered the night's fragile sense of security. Someone had thrown a brick through Maria's window, and tied to it was a note written in block letters, "Sell now or face the consequences." The escalation from surveillance to direct intimidation marked a new phase in the conflict. As Carmen called 911 and Joey secured the broken window with cardboard and duct tape, Maria realized that Harold Hartwell's final gift had transformed her from a grieving widow trying to rebuild her life into a reluctant warrior fighting for her community's survival.
The battle for Harold's crane yard had become a battle for the soul of her town, and Maria Santos was about to discover strengths she never knew she possessed. The FBI arrived at 6:34 a.m. in 3 black SUVs that moved through the morning mist like ships in a ghostly harbor. Special Agent Sarah Mitchell stepped out of the lead vehicle with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to transforming chaos into order. At 38, Mitchell had built her career on unraveling complex financial crimes. But the case that Margaret Chen and attorney Fitzgerald had presented to the federal task force represented one of the most sophisticated corporate conspiracies she'd encountered. Maria watched from Joey's cabin window as the convoy of federal agents, environmental investigators, and media representatives descended on her quiet town like an invading army. The cabin sat on a wooded hillside 40 miles north of the crane yard, connected to the outside world only by Joey's uncle's ancient landline telephone and a battery-powered radio that crackled with news updates every hour. Channel 7 is calling it the biggest federal investigation in county history, Carmen reported, tuning the radio to catch the morning news. Rebecca Walsh is practically vibrating with excitement. She's claiming this proves her reporting on environmental hazards was ahead of the curve. Dr. Reeves looked up from the environmental impact studies he'd been reviewing since dawn. The irony is that Walsh's reporting probably helped accelerate Meridian Mining's timeline. Once federal attention started focusing on the property, they had to move quickly before regulatory oversight shut down their acquisition efforts. The landline phone rang with the urgent persistence of breaking news. Margaret Chen answered and immediately began taking notes, her journalist's shorthand capturing details faster than most people could speak. When she hung up, her expression carried the satisfaction of someone watching a carefully planned operation unfold exactly as intended. Agent Mitchell's team executed search warrants simultaneously at 17 locations: Frank Hartwell's office, Mayor Richardson's home, Meridian Mining's regional headquarters, and 14 other properties connected to the conspiracy. They found evidence that exceeded even Harold's most paranoid assumptions. She consulted her notes with the precision of someone accustomed to getting facts exactly right. Meridian Mining's computers contained emails discussing elimination of resistance and escalated pressure tactics. Frank Hartwell's files included detailed psychological profiles of Harold and Maria, apparently compiled to identify the most effective intimidation strategies. Attorney Fitzgerald had spent the night reviewing federal statutes and preparing for what he called the legal battle of the century. Now he looked up from his legal briefs with grim satisfaction. Psychological profiling for purposes of harassment constitutes stalking under federal law. Combined with the conspiracy and fraud charges, we're looking at potential sentences of 30 years for the primary defendants. But even as the federal investigation unfolded, Maria found herself struggling with questions that legal victories couldn't answer. Harold had chosen her as his heir because he believed she would fight for something bigger than her own interests. But what exactly was she fighting for? The money? The principle? The community? Joey returned from his morning reconnaissance with coffee and disturbing news. There are reporters camped outside your house, at the garage, and at the crane yard.
But that's not the worst part. Someone broke into Rodriguez Auto Repair last night and trashed Miguel's office. They were clearly looking for something specific. The attack on Miguel's garage felt like a violation of everything Maria held sacred. Miguel had been her sanctuary during the darkest months after Tommy's death, the place where honest work and mechanical logic provided structure when the rest of her world felt like chaos. The idea that corporate criminals had invaded that space with their greed and violence made her angrier than any personal threat could. "I'm going back," Maria announced, standing up with sudden determination. Carmen immediately protested. "Maria, that's exactly what they want. You're safe here. Let the federal agents do their work."
"Miguel is probably afraid to open his garage because of me," Maria replied. "Mrs. Patterson needs her car for dialysis appointments. The Hendersons depend on Miguel to keep their delivery truck running so they can support their family. I won't let innocent people suffer because I inherited something valuable." Dr. Reeves looked up from his environmental studies with concern. "Ms. Santos, Meridian Mining has a history of escalating to violence when legal pressure mounts. Their operation in Montana included 2 suspicious accidents that investigators could never prove were intentional." "Then they'll have to go through federal agents to get to me," Maria said. "Margaret, can you call Agent Mitchell and tell her I'm coming back to town?" The drive back to town felt like returning to a war zone. News vans lined the main streets, satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like mechanical flowers seeking signal instead of sunlight. Reporters clustered around key locations like antibodies responding to infection, ready to swarm anyone connected to the unfolding story. Agent Mitchell met Maria at the crane yard, which had been transformed into a federal crime scene. Evidence technicians in white coveralls moved among Harold's abandoned cranes with methodical precision, photographing everything and collecting samples of the disturbed earth where the midnight excavation had occurred. "Miss Santos," Agent Mitchell said, extending a firm handshake, "thank you for your cooperation in this investigation. What you and Mr. Hartwell documented has given us the foundation for dismantling a criminal conspiracy that spans multiple states and involves millions of dollars in fraudulent activities." Mitchell was a compact woman with steel-gray eyes and the economical movements of someone who wasted neither time nor energy. Her presence transformed the crane yard from a battlefield into a secured perimeter where justice could operate without interference. "How extensive is the conspiracy?" Maria asked, still struggling to comprehend the scope of what Harold had uncovered. "Larger than anyone imagined," Mitchell replied. "Meridian Mining has been operating similar schemes in 7 states over the past decade. They've successfully acquired mineral rights worth an estimated $400 million through fraud, intimidation, and regulatory manipulation. Your inheritance represents the first time anyone has been able to document their complete playbook." She led Maria to a mobile command center that the FBI had established near the crane yard's main gate. Inside, wall-mounted screens displayed organizational charts that mapped the relationships between Meridian Mining, local accomplices, and a network of shell companies designed to obscure the true ownership of acquired properties. Frank Hartwell was more than just a local real estate developer, Mitchell explained, pointing to a web of connections that linked Frank to Meridian Mining's operations in Montana, Colorado, and Wyoming. He's been their primary acquisition specialist for rural mineral rights, using his local knowledge and family connections to identify and pressure property owners. The organizational chart revealed the sophisticated nature of the conspiracy. Meridian Mining had created an entire ecosystem of corruption, with local politicians providing regulatory pressure, financial institutions calling in loans on targeted properties, and media outlets shaping public opinion to support land acquisitions disguised as community development. Mayor Richardson received $200,000 in consulting fees over the past 3 years.
3 city council members were given no-interest loans to purchase vacation properties. The district attorney's campaign was funded by donations from Meridian's shell companies. Maria studied the chart with growing amazement and horror. They bought an entire town government. They bought the appearance of legitimate governments while maintaining plausible deniability, Mitchell corrected. It's a sophisticated form of legalized corruption that operates just within the boundaries of existing law until they escalate to direct threats and property destruction.
The rusted chains groaned against the December wind as Maria Santos stood knee-deep in twisted metal and broken dreams. Her calloused hands gripped the yellowed envelope that had changed everything. The deed to Hartwell Construction's abandoned crane yard, a graveyard of industrial giants that stretched across 43 acres of what the town council called an eyesore, and what her late husband Tommy had called potential. The laughter still echoed in her ears from this morning's town meeting. Mayor Richardson's smirk had been particularly cutting when he'd announced her inheritance to the room full of contractors, city planners, and business owners. "Ladies and gentlemen," he'd said, his voice dripping with manufactured sympathy, "it seems our local mechanic, Maria Santos, has inherited Harold Hartwell's little situation." The word situation had hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Behind her, the sound of tires crunching on gravel announced the arrival of her best friend, Carmen Rodriguez, whose beat-up Honda Civic looked almost pristine compared to the skeletal remains of construction equipment that surrounded them. Carmen stepped out, her nurse scrubs still bearing traces of her 12-hour shift at County General, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that had seen better days. "Dios mío, Maria," Carmen breathed, surveying the devastation. "When you said it was bad, I thought you meant, I don't know, maybe some broken windows and rust." Maria kicked at a piece of corrugated metal, sending it clanging against what had once been the cabin of a tower crane. Harold Hartwell was Tommy's mentor back in the day. Taught him everything about heavy machinery. Tommy always said Harold was like a father to him after his own dad died. The crane yard stretched before them like a metallic desert. Dozens of cranes in various states of decay dotted the landscape, some missing their jibs, others with their towers collapsed like the spines of prehistoric beasts. Weeds grew through broken concrete, and puddles of rainwater reflected the gray December sky from oil-stained depressions in the earth. Carmen pulled her jacket tighter. "So, why did he leave this to you instead of his family?" That's what everyone's wondering. Maria walked toward the largest structure, a massive mobile crane whose yellow paint had faded to the color of old mustard. His nephew Frank was furious at the reading. "Keeps saying I must have manipulated the old man somehow." The lawyer said Harold was very specific. The entire yard goes to Maria Santos, the only person who understood what Tommy saw in broken things. A memory flickered through Maria's mind like sunlight through storm clouds. 3 years ago, just months before Tommy's accident, they'd driven past this very yard on their way to the hardware store. The place had been operational then, Harold Hartwell's construction company still limping along despite the economic downturn. Tommy had pointed to a crane operator working the big leaper near the front gate. "That's Harold," Tommy had said with genuine affection. "Man's been working cranes for 50 years. Started when they were all cable-operated death traps. Now look at him, 78 years old and still running jobs that would scare men half his age."
Agent Mitchell looked up from her case files. "Are you suggesting the property could be both environmentally protected and economically productive?" "Harold understood something that Meridian Mining ignored," Dr. Reeves replied. "Maria could mine the land without destroying it and make even more money than the corrupt company. The possibility of environmental and economic harmony represented a third option that no one had previously considered. Maria didn't have to choose between preserving the land and benefiting from its resources. She could potentially do both. As the day progressed, more revelations emerged from the federal investigation. Meridian Mining's computers contained emails discussing plans to expand their operation to cover over 15,000 acres, essentially industrializing the entire county. Their projections showed extraction activities that would have poisoned the groundwater for 3 counties and displaced over 2,000 families from their homes. Harold didn't just save his own property, Attorney Fitzgerald realized as he reviewed the seized documents. He saved an entire region from environmental catastrophe. Late in the afternoon, Joey arrived at the crane yard with news that changed everything. "Maria, you need to see what we found in the back section of the property." He led her to an area that had been overlooked during the initial investigation, a concrete foundation partially hidden by overgrown weeds and accumulated debris. But this wasn't the foundation of a demolished building. It was the foundation of a building that had never been completed. Harold was building something back here, Joey explained, pointing to carefully laid rebar and precision-poured concrete footings. This foundation is designed to support serious weight, industrial machinery, maybe manufacturing equipment. Dr. Reeves examined the foundation with growing excitement. These specifications would be perfect for a rare earth mineral processing facility. Harold wasn't just planning to mine the deposit, he was planning to create a complete extraction and refinement operation right here on the property. Hidden beneath a tarp in a nearby storage shed, they found architectural plans and engineering specifications for what Harold had called Hartwell Sustainable Mining, a comprehensive proposal for environmentally responsible rare earth mineral extraction that would have employed over 200 people and generated millions in tax revenue for the local community. Harold spent his final years designing a mining operation that would compete directly with Meridian's environmental destruction. He wasn't just fighting to save his land, he was fighting to prove that sustainable mining was economically viable. The discovery of Harold's alternative mining proposal transformed Maria's inheritance from a defensive battle into an offensive opportunity. She didn't just own valuable land. She owned a complete business plan for challenging the corporate practices that had destroyed Harold's company and threatened her community. As the sun set over the crane yard on what had been the most revelatory day in the county's history, Maria stood among Harold's cranes with a new understanding of her role in his final construction project. She wasn't just the inheritor of his property, she was the project manager for his vision of economic justice and environmental responsibility. The federal investigation had exposed the criminals and protected her from immediate danger, but the real work was just beginning. 6 months after the federal arrests sent shockwaves through corporate boardrooms from Wall Street to Silicon Valley, Maria Santos stood in the cab of Harold's restored crane, overlooking a transformation that defied every expert prediction. The Hartwell Sustainable Mining operation employed 187 people, generated over $3 million in quarterly revenue, and had become a model for environmentally responsible rare earth mineral extraction that attracted visitors from around the world. The crane beneath her feet hummed with the quiet power of precision engineering restored to its intended purpose. What had once been seen as industrial wreckage had become the backbone of an operation that proved sustainable mining wasn't just possible, it was more profitable than the destructive methods favored by corporations like Meridian Mining.
Joey Martinez approached the crane carrying morning production reports and wearing the satisfied expression of a man whose loyalty had been vindicated. As Maria's operations manager, Joey had overseen the restoration of Harold's equipment and the training of workers in sustainable extraction techniques that preserved soil integrity while accessing the mineral deposits below. Daily output is up 12% from last month, Joey reported, climbing into the crane cab with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged there. Dr. Reeves says our environmental impact remains within optimal parameters, and we're actually improving soil quality in the extraction areas through our restoration protocols. The view from the crane cab encompassed 43 acres that had been transformed from industrial wasteland into a carefully managed operation that looked more like a garden than a mining site. Precision extraction points were scattered across the property, each one surrounded by native plants that actually benefited from the minerals brought to the surface during the mining process. Carmen called from the hospital. She wanted to remind you about the town council meeting tonight. They're voting on the ordinance that would regulate mining operations throughout the county. The proposed ordinance represented everything Harold had fought for during his final years: environmental protection standards that would prevent corporations like Meridian Mining from operating in the county while allowing responsible operations like Maria's to thrive. It was legislation born from Harold's documentation and refined through 6 months of community input and environmental testing. Maria climbed down from the crane and walked toward the newly constructed administrative building that housed Hartwell Sustainable Mining's offices. The building itself was a statement of purpose. Constructed from recycled materials and powered entirely by solar panels and wind turbines, it demonstrated that industrial operations could enhance rather than degrade their environment. Inside the building, Margaret Chen was conducting an interview with representatives from 3 foreign governments interested in replicating Harold's sustainable mining model in their own countries. The international attention had transformed Maria from a small-town mechanic into an inadvertent spokesperson for economic justice and environmental responsibility. The key insight, Maria was explaining to the delegation from Denmark, is that sustainable mining requires patience and precision rather than speed and volume. When you respect the land, it provides resources indefinitely rather than being depleted and destroyed. The transformation of Harold's vision into operational reality had required navigating challenges that no business school curriculum could have prepared her for. Maria had spent months learning about rare earth mineral markets, environmental regulations, international trade agreements, and the complex chemistry of sustainable extraction processes. But the most challenging aspect had been managing the human dynamics of building a company that operated according to principles rather than purely profit-driven motivations. Every employee at Hartwell Sustainable Mining received equity ownership in the company, healthcare benefits that exceeded industry standards, and profit-sharing bonuses that increased as environmental performance increased. Harold believed that companies succeed when they take care of their workers and their environment. Maria had explained to skeptical investors during the early months of operation. We're proving that responsible business practices create value rather than reducing it. The proof was in the numbers. Maria's company was making more money than anyone expected while actually helping the environment. Dr. Reeves had become the company's chief environmental officer, overseeing research into extraction techniques that other mining companies were beginning to study and adopt. His work had attracted attention from universities and environmental organizations worldwide, establishing the crane yard as an unexpected center for mining innovation. We've received inquiries from mining companies in Australia, Chile, and South Africa, Dr. Reeves reported during the weekly environmental impact meeting. They want to license our extraction processes and environmental monitoring systems. The licensing agreements represented a new revenue stream that Harold probably never imagined, selling sustainable mining expertise to companies that had previously relied on environmentally destructive methods. Each licensing agreement included requirements for environmental performance standards and worker protection protocols, spreading Harold's values across the global mining industry.
Attorney Fitzgerald had overseen the legal transformation of Maria's inheritance into a comprehensive business enterprise that protected both her interests and Harold's principles. The corporate structure he designed ensured that Hartwell Sustainable Mining could never be acquired by entities that didn't commit to environmental and social responsibility standards. Harold's vision was always larger than just one mining operation, Fitzgerald explained to Maria during their monthly legal review. He wanted to prove that business success and social responsibility weren't contradictory goals. The corporate structure we've created ensures that his principles survive regardless of changes in ownership or management. The legal protections had proven necessary as the success of Hartwell Sustainable Mining attracted acquisition offers from corporations eager to capitalize on the growing market for sustainably extracted rare earth minerals. Each offer was declined, not because of insufficient money, but because of inadequate commitment to environmental and social responsibility. Carmen had taken a leave of absence from her nursing job to serve as Hartwell Sustainable Mining's Human Resources Director, applying her crisis management skills to building workplace policies that prioritized employee well-being. Her background in healthcare had proven invaluable in creating safety protocols that exceeded industry standards. "We've gone 8 months without a workplace injury," Carmen reported with pride. "Our safety record is better than most office environments, let alone mining operations." The safety achievements reflected Harold's belief that dangerous working conditions were usually the result of cutting corners for profit rather than inherent risks of the work itself. Proper equipment, adequate training, and sufficient time to complete tasks safely eliminated most of the hazards that plagued corporate mining operations. As the first anniversary of Harold's death approached, Maria found herself reflecting on the man who had changed her life by recognizing potential she hadn't known she possessed. Harold had seen past her grief and circumstances to identify qualities that made her the right person to carry forward his vision. The memorial service held at the crane yard drew over 500 people, including former employees, community members, and business leaders from across the state. But the most meaningful tribute came from the 43 families whose lives had been improved by jobs at Hartwell Sustainable Mining, people who had found economic security and purpose in work that contributed to their community's long-term well-being. Mayor Richardson, who had been replaced in a special election after his role in the Meridian mining conspiracy was exposed, attended the memorial to offer a public apology for his participation in the scheme that had nearly destroyed Harold's legacy. "Harold Hartwell was a better man than I understood at the time," Richardson said, his voice carrying genuine remorse. "His vision for this community was more generous and more sustainable than anything I had imagined possible." The apology was accepted by Harold's memory and the community he had served, but it also served as a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything Harold had worked to protect. Frank Hartwell was serving a 12-year federal sentence for conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering. From prison, he had issued a statement expressing regret for his actions and acknowledging that his uncle's vision had proven superior to the corporate model he had embraced. "Harold understood something about business that I never learned," Frank's statement read. "Success isn't just about maximizing profits, it's about creating value that lasts beyond your own lifetime."
Miguel had hired Maria initially as a favor to Tommy, but she'd quickly proven herself capable of diagnostic work that most mechanics couldn't handle. Miguel was already at the garage when she arrived, his stocky frame hunched over the engine of Mrs. Patterson's Buick. At 55, Miguel had the permanent oil stains under his fingernails that marked a man who'd spent his life elbow-deep in automotive problems. But his eyes still lit up with genuine pleasure when a particularly challenging repair crossed his bay. "Morning, Maria," he called without looking up from the engine. "How are you holding up after yesterday's circus?" "You heard about it?" Miguel straightened, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better decades. "Rebecca Walsh called here this morning, asking questions about you. Wanted to know if you were financially stable enough to handle such a significant environmental responsibility. I told her to call back when she learned some manners." The loyalty in his voice made Maria's throat tighten. Since Tommy's death, Miguel had become more than just her boss. He was the closest thing to a father figure she had left. He'd held her job open during the 3 weeks she'd been too devastated to get out of bed. He'd covered for her when grief made her hands shake too badly to hold tools. He'd never once made her feel like charity. "People are talking," she said quietly. "People always talk, usually about things they don't understand." Miguel picked up a wrench and tossed it to her with practiced ease. "Mrs. Patterson's Buick is making that sound again, the one that's not quite a knock but isn't exactly normal either. Thought you might want to take a listen." Work had become Maria's salvation in the months after Tommy's death. The honesty of mechanical problems, the clear relationship between cause and effect, the satisfaction of restoration, these things provided structure when the rest of her life felt like it was built on quicksand. She popped the hood of the Buick and listened to the engine idle, her trained ear picking up the subtle irregularity that had Mrs. Patterson worried. It wasn't a knock. The sound was higher-pitched, more intermittent. She moved around the engine bay, using a mechanic's stethoscope to isolate the source of the noise. "Timing chain tensioner," she diagnosed after 5 minutes of careful listening. "It's not critical yet, but it will be soon." Miguel nodded approvingly. "That's what I figured, but I wanted your confirmation before I quoted Mrs. Patterson the repair cost." As Maria began the process of removing the engine cover to access the timing chain, her mind drifted to Harold's cranes. Were they really beyond salvation, as everyone seemed to believe, or were they just complicated problems that required patient diagnosis and the right approach? The morning passed in the comfortable rhythm of repair work. Maria replaced Mrs. Patterson's timing chain tensioner, diagnosed a mysterious electrical drain in a Honda Civic, and helped Miguel install new brake pads on a contractor's pickup truck. Each repair followed the same basic pattern: identify the problem, understand its cause, implement the solution, test the results. At lunch, she sat in the garage's small office, eating a sandwich she'd packed at home while reading more about Harold's company. According to the financial documents she'd found online, Hartwell Construction had assets worth nearly $2 million at its peak. Even accounting for depreciation and debt, the crane yard should have been worth something significant. So why was Frank so eager to buy it for $50,000? Her phone rang, interrupting her research. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, the voice was familiar. "Miss Santos, this is attorney Jonathan Fitzgerald. I handled Mr. Hartwell's estate. I was wondering if you might have time to meet this afternoon. There are some additional documents Mr. Hartwell asked me to give you after you'd had a chance to visit the property."
More documents. More mysteries. Maria agreed to meet at Fitzgerald's office at 4 o'clock, then spent the rest of her lunch break staring at photographs of Harold's cranes, trying to see beyond the rust and abandonment to whatever truth Harold had wanted her to find. The afternoon brought a steady stream of routine repairs, but Maria's concentration kept drifting to the crane yard. She found herself remembering conversations with Tommy about Harold, fragments of stories about the old man's legendary attention to detail and his reputation for engineering solutions that other contractors couldn't imagine. Harold never met a job he couldn't figure out, Tommy had told her once. Other guys would look at a project and say it was impossible. Harold would look at the same project and start sketching out crane configurations and load calculations. He saw possibilities where everyone else saw problems. At 3:45, Maria washed the grease from her hands and drove across town to Attorney Fitzgerald's office. The law firm of Fitzgerald, Webb & Associates occupied a converted Victorian house on Elm Street, the kind of dignified, understated building that suggested competence without ostentation. Jonathan Fitzgerald was a thin man in his early 60s with silver hair and the careful demeanor of someone who'd spent his career helping people navigate life's complications. His office was lined with law books and family photographs, creating an atmosphere of both professionalism and warmth. "Mr. Hartwell was very specific about the timing of this meeting," Fitzgerald began, settling behind his mahogany desk. "He wanted you to see the property first, to form your own impressions before I gave you this." He handed her a thick manila envelope sealed with red wax, old-fashioned and formal, like something from an earlier century. Maria's name was written across the front in Harold's shaky handwriting. "He also wanted me to tell you that he watched you work on your husband's truck several times.
He was impressed by your patience and your willingness to keep trying different approaches until you found the solution. Maria's hands trembled slightly as she broke the wax seal. Inside the envelope were 3 items: a folded letter, a small brass key, and a hand-drawn map of the crane yard with certain areas marked in red ink. The letter was written in the same careful cursive as the note she'd found in the crane cab. Dear Maria, by now you've seen what everyone else sees, a yard full of broken dreams and failed machinery. The town council calls it an eyesore. Frank calls it a liability. The news reporter probably called it worse. But Tommy saw potential in broken things, and he married a woman who shares that gift. I'm betting you see something else when you look in my cranes. The brass key opens a storage container buried beneath the main office foundation. You'll need Joey Martinez to help you with that. He knows about the container, and he has the equipment to move the concrete slab that covers it. What you'll find there will change how everyone sees this place. But more than that, it will change how everyone sees you. I spent 50 years building things that lasted. This is my final construction project, and you're the foreman I've chosen to see it through. Look for the truth in the foundation, Maria. It's been waiting for someone with the right eyes to find it. Respectfully yours, Harold Hartwell. P.S. Don't trust Frank. His interest in this property isn't what it seems.
Joey Martinez had been promoted to Regional Operations Director, overseeing sustainable mining projects across 5 states. His loyalty to Harold's memory had evolved into expertise in community-controlled resource development that made him one of the most sought-after consultants in the emerging sustainable mining industry. The Montana project is 6 months ahead of schedule, Joey reported during their weekly review meeting. The local community is so pleased with our environmental restoration work that they're asking us to expand operations to cover additional mineral deposits. The Montana project represented Harold's vision operating at scale, a 2,400-acre sustainable mining operation that employed 180 people while actually improving the environmental quality of land that had been damaged by previous corporate extraction efforts. The success had attracted attention from Native American tribal governments interested in developing their mineral resources according to traditional environmental values. Carmen Rodriguez had left her position as Human Resources Director to attend law school, specializing in environmental and corporate law. Her goal was to help other communities protect themselves from the kind of corporate exploitation that Harold had fought against during his final years. I want to be able to fight these battles in courtrooms before they reach the point where people like Harold have to sacrifice their lives to protect their communities, Carmen explained during her graduation ceremony from the state law school. Her first case after passing the bar exam involved representing a farming community in Arizona that was resisting pressure from a corporate mining operation. Using legal strategies developed during the Meridian mining investigation, Carmen succeeded in forcing the corporation to adopt environmental and social responsibility standards that protected both the land and the local economy. Dr. Reeves had established the Hartwell Institute as an internationally recognized center for sustainable extraction research. Scientists from universities around the world conducted research at the crane yard, developing new techniques for accessing mineral resources while enhancing rather than degrading environmental quality. Harold's insight was that mining could be a form of land stewardship rather than land exploitation, Dr. Reeves explained to a group of graduate students from MIT. Every extraction project should leave the environment better than it was found. The Institute's research had revolutionized understanding of sustainable mining, proving that environmental protection and resource extraction could not only coexist, but could actually enhance each other when approached with proper scientific rigor and community accountability. 8 years later, Margaret Chen's book had inspired documentary films, university courses, and policy changes at the federal level that regulated mining operations according to environmental and social responsibility standards.
The Harold Hartwell effect had become shorthand for community resistance that transformed corporate practices through persistent documentation and strategic resistance. Maria's speaking engagements had evolved into a full-time role as an advocate for community-controlled economic development. The Maria Santos Foundation provided technical assistance and startup funding for communities seeking to develop their natural resources according to sustainable principles. Harold taught me that broken things often contain the seeds of something better. The challenge is having the patience and vision to nurture those seeds into full growth. The foundation had supported 37 community development projects across 4 continents, each one adapting Harold's principles to local conditions and cultural values. Mining communities in Bolivia, farming communities in Ghana, and fishing communities in the Philippines had used Harold's documentation strategies and community organizing techniques to resist corporate exploitation while developing sustainable alternatives. Frank Hartwell had been released from federal prison after serving 9 years of his sentence. His first act as a free man was to visit the crane yard and apologize to Maria for his role in the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed Harold's legacy.
"I spent 9 years thinking about what Harold was trying to accomplish," Frank said, standing among the cranes that had been restored to productive purpose. "I finally understand that he wasn't just protecting his land. He was protecting an entire way of life that I had been too greedy to appreciate." Frank's apology was accepted, and Maria offered him a position with the foundation, helping other communities recognize and resist corporate pressure tactics. His insider knowledge of corporate strategy had proven valuable in preparing communities for the challenges they would face when asserting control over their natural resources. 10 years later, the crane yard had become a United Nations World Heritage Site, recognized for its role in demonstrating that industrial activity could enhance rather than degrade environmental quality. The designation attracted over 100,000 visitors annually, each group learning about Harold's vision and the community organizing strategies that had made its implementation possible. Maria's daughter, Elena Santos Chen, adopted from Maria's partnership with Margaret Chen, celebrated her 8th birthday among the cranes that had become symbols of community resilience and environmental responsibility. Elena's generation was growing up with the understanding that business success meant serving communities and protecting the environment, rather than exploiting them. "Tell me again about Great-Uncle Harold," Elena would ask, using the honorary title that Maria had taught her for the man whose vision had shaped their family's life. Harold understood that everything broken can be fixed if you have the right tools and enough patience. The most important tool is love for your community. The most important ingredient is the patience to build something that will last. The Tommy Santos Memorial Workshop had expanded into a full technical college that attracted students from around the world. The curriculum combined traditional mechanical skills with cutting-edge sustainable technology, creating graduates who could serve their communities while earning good livings in the growing sustainable economy. Miguel Rodriguez, now 73 years old, served as the college's Dean Emeritus, still teaching advanced automotive repair while mentoring young instructors in the art of patient, thorough craftsmanship that Harold and Tommy had embodied. "Every machine has a story to tell," Miguel would tell his students. "Learning to listen to those stories is the difference between being a technician and being a craftsman." 15 years later, the sustainable mining industry that Harold's vision had helped create now employed over 50,000 people worldwide and generated annual revenues exceeding $8 billion. But more important than the financial success was the cultural transformation that had occurred. Mining was no longer synonymous with environmental destruction. Maria, now recognized as one of the world's leading advocates for community-controlled economic development, had been invited to speak at the World Economic Forum about the transformation of global resource extraction industries. Harold Hartwell was a construction worker who understood something that business schools are finally beginning to teach. Sustainable prosperity requires serving communities rather than exploiting them. The principles that Harold had embodied, patience, community accountability, environmental responsibility, and long-term thinking, had become standard practices in industries far beyond mining. The Hartwell Standard was recognized internationally as a certification for businesses that prioritized community welfare and environmental protection while maintaining economic viability.
Joey Martinez had been elected to the state legislature, where he championed policies supporting community-controlled economic development and environmental protection. His first legislative victory was a bill requiring corporate mining operations to demonstrate community benefit and environmental enhancement before receiving permits. Harold's legacy isn't just about mining, Joey explained during his inaugural address. It's about proving that communities can control their own economic development when they have the right tools and support. Carmen Rodriguez had become a federal judge, using her position to protect communities from corporate exploitation while ensuring that business development served public interests. Her rulings in environmental and corporate law cases were studied in law schools as examples of how legal systems could serve community welfare rather than just corporate profits. Dr. Reeves, now 84 years old, continued his research at the Hartwell Institute while training a new generation of environmental scientists in the principles of sustainable resource development. His Lifetime Achievement Award from the Environmental Protection Agency recognized his role in transforming mining from an environmentally destructive industry into a model for sustainable development. 20 years later, Maria stood once again in the cab of Harold's restored crane, but now she was accompanied by Elena, who at 28 had become the director of the Maria Santos Foundation and was preparing to carry Harold's vision into the next generation. The view from the crane encompassed not just the original 43 acres, but a 400-acre campus that included the sustainable mining operation, the technical college, the research institute, and a residential community where workers and their families lived in homes powered by renewable energy and surrounded by restored natural habitat. Great-Uncle Harold would be amazed by what his vision became, Elena said, studying the bustling community that had grown from Harold's simple belief that business could serve communities rather than exploiting them. Harold understood something that most people missed, Maria replied, her voice carrying the wisdom of 2 decades spent nurturing Harold's vision into reality. He knew that broken things aren't worthless, they're opportunities to build something better. The crane yard had become a symbol of hope for communities around the world, facing corporate pressure to surrender control of their natural resources. Harold's story was taught in schools as an example of how individual resistance could transform entire industries when supported by community solidarity and scientific rigor. The Hartwell model had been replicated in over 200 communities worldwide, each adaptation proving that local control of economic development was not only possible, but more sustainable and profitable than corporate extraction models.
As the sun set over the community that Harold Hartwell's vision had created, Maria reflected on the journey from that December morning when she had first stood among his abandoned cranes. Harold had left her more than valuable land. He had left her a blueprint for proving that ordinary people could build extraordinary alternatives to corporate exploitation. The cranes that had once been symbols of industrial decay now reached toward the sky like monuments to the power of community vision and persistent work. Each crane told a story of transformation, of broken things restored to purpose, of dreams that survived the people who dreamed them. Harold's final construction project was complete, but his blueprint continued to inspire new projects around the world. Communities facing corporate pressure now had proof that resistance was possible and alternatives were practical.
The foundation Harold had built was not made of concrete and steel, but of principles and people who understood that sustainable prosperity required serving communities rather than exploiting them. As Maria climbed down from Harold's crane for the final time as its owner, she was donating the entire operation to a community trust to ensure its principles would survive any changes in leadership. She carried with her the satisfaction of work completed and vision fulfilled. Tomorrow, a new generation would climb into Harold's cranes and continue building the future he had imagined. A future where business served communities, where technology protected the environment, and where ordinary people had the tools and support they needed to control their own economic development. Harold Hartwell's final gift had been the proof that such a future was not just possible, it was inevitable when communities had the courage to claim it. If this incredible, true story inspired you, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear Maria's amazing journey. Your support helps us bring you more unbelievable stories like this one.